Hello, everyone.
And welcome to The Chronicles.
Today, we're diving into the second industrial revolution and its technological advancements in steel, chemicals, electricity, and new transportation methods like railroads, steamships, and telegraphs. These breakthroughs changed the world in a huge way.
We'll also talk about the spread of industrialization and how the US and Russia had very different paths. We'll look at how Latin American countries were influenced by foreign investment and resource extraction to industrialize.
As these changes unfolded, reactions like socialism emerged as a response to the inequalities created by capitalism. We'll explore how labor movements fought for workers' rights in the 19th century.
And finally, we'll be discussing the industrialization efforts in Asia and the Ottoman Empire. Let's get started.
We're starting off with the second industrial revolution, where advancements in steel, chemical, and electricity reshaped production and daily life.
It's amazing how these industries intersected and really transformed the world. Let's start with steel.
Absolutely. One of the biggest game changers was the Bessemer process, which allowed for the mass production of steel at a fraction of the cost. This made steel more accessible, and it started being used for everything from bridges to railroads to machinery. Henry Bessemer said before the Bessemer process, steel was as costly as gold. After it was as cheap as iron.
And in addition to steel, the chemical industry had some major breakthroughs.
Definitely. The chemical industry saw development of things like synthetic dyes, fertilizers, and pharmaceuticals, all of which had massive impacts on sectors like agricultural, medicine, and manufacturing.
That's wild. The idea of synthetic fertilizers, for example, must have been a huge deal for farmers.
Exactly. Synthetic fertilizers made farming more productive, which in turn supported larger populations and helped cities grow. It wasn't just about making more food though. Chemical advancements also made industrial processes more efficient and cost-effective.
And then, of course, electricity was another huge factor.
Right, the invention of the electric generator and the power grid was pivotal. Electricity transformed factories by allowing them to run more efficiently with electric machinery, which meant faster production and a rise of mass production.
Now, in the 19th century, we saw some pretty significant advancements in communication and transportation that really shaped migration patterns, both internally and internationally. One of the biggest game changers was the railroad.
Right, railroads completely transformed travel, didn't they?
Exactly. Railroads revolutionized internal migration. They gave people a faster, more reliable way to travel over long distances, which made it easier to move from rural areas to urban ones in search of work or better living conditions. The expansion of rail networks meant that people could move goods and themselves more efficiently, helping cities grow and industrial regions develop. William H. Vanderbilt claimed the railroad is the supreme agent of industrialization and modern civilization.
And steamships played a huge part in the world of migration too, right?
Absolutely. Steamships were essential for both internal and international migration along rivers and coastlines. They made it much easier for people to move within countries, but their biggest impact was on international migration. Steamships made crossing oceans much faster, more affordable, and safer, which led to a huge increase in European immigration to the Americas, Australia, and other parts of the world.
And the telegraph, right? That had to play a role in connecting and making migration easier.
Definitely. The telegraph revolutionized communication by allowing information to be transmitted instantly over long distances. This really impacted migration patterns because people could get news about opportunities in faraway places faster.
Now, let's shift to the spread of industrialization. Okay, so the US and Russia had completely different industrialization experiences. The US was all about rapid expansion, private businesses, and innovation. Meanwhile, Russia was more state-controlled and, let's just say, a little slower at getting things going.
Slower how?
Well, in the US, industrialization really took off in the early 19th century. They had a ton of natural resources, waves of immigrants providing labor, and the government actually helped by investing in infrastructure, like railroads. By the 1800s, cities like New York and Chicago were booming, and the US was on its way to becoming an industrial superpower.
So big factories, railroads, steel production, that kind of thing?
Exactly. Plus, the economy was growing fast, but industrialization also came with problems like long work hours, terrible factory conditions, and a huge gap between the rich and poor.
But wasn't Russia dealing with that too?
Yeah, but Russia's situation was different. For most of the 19th century, they were still stuck in feudalism. Serfdom wasn't abolished until 1861, so industrialization started much later. And instead of private businesses leading the charge like in the US, the Russian government had to push industrial growth themselves. Peter the Great once said Russia is a land of contrast where centuries-old traditions clash with the demands of modern industrialization.
Was that a bad thing though?
Well, it kind of worked. Russia did invest in major projects like the Trans-Siberian Railway and built up heavy industries like steel and coal. But the problem was that industrialization wasn't widespread. It was mostly limited to a few cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow.
So while the US had a booming middle class, Russia's wealth stayed with the elites?
Exactly, the working class in Russia barely benefited, and the poor conditions fueled a lot of unrest. So while industrialization happened, it didn't create the same kind of economic power as it did in the US. And what did that lead to?
The Russian Revolution.
Yep. Meanwhile, the US was on its way to becoming an industrial giant, so if we're comparing, the US industrialized more successfully.
Okay, now let's shift gears. Miles, what about Latin America?
Oh, Latin America's industrialization story is completely different. Actually, it's kind of a story of non-industrialization.
Wait, what do you mean?
I mean, unlike the US or even Russia, Latin America didn't really industrialize in the 19th century. Instead, most countries focused on exporting raw materials like coffee, sugar, and minerals to industrialized nations.
So they were supplying the materials but not building their own industries?
Exactly, they relied on foreign countries, mainly Britain and the US, to buy their resources. And while that made some countries rich, it also made them dependent.
Was there any industrialization at all?
A little. Juan Perón, an Argentinian military officer and politician, even said Latin America must industrialize if it is to become truly independent and prosper. Countries like Argentina and Mexico built railroads and had some factories, but it was nothing compared to what was happening in the US or even Russia. The economies were still mostly based on agriculture and resource exports.
But why didn't industrialization take off?
A few reasons. First, political instability. Constant revolutions and leadership changes made it hard to invest in long-term industrial processes. Second, foreign control, where European and American businesses dominated trade, which meant local industries couldn't really grow. And third, social inequality. Having most of the wealth was concentrated in the hands of the elite, so there wasn't a strong middle class to drive industrial expansion.
And that shaped how these regions developed into the modern era.
Exactly. Industrialization wasn't just about factories. It determined who would become world powers and who would struggle to industrialize. So we just talked about how industrialization shaped different parts of the world, but there's another major movement that came out of this period, socialism.
Right, as industrialization spread, so did capitalism, and not everyone was happy with how that turned out.
Exactly. Socialism didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was a direct response to the inequalities and problems that people saw in capitalism. To really understand why, we need to break down both systems.
All right, let's start with capitalism.
Okay, capitalism is an economic system where private individuals or businesses own capital goods. Instead of the government controlling production, it's all about supply and demand in the market. It emphasizes private property, free markets, and competition. Supporters say this leads to innovation, efficiency, and economic growth.
But obviously not everyone saw capitalism in such a positive light.
Exactly. A lot of people argued that capitalism created serious inequalities. That's where socialism comes in. Socialism is the idea that basically means of production, factories, land, resources should be collectively owned or at least heavily regulated by the government to promote fairness and equality.
So instead of private businesses controlling everything, the community or the state would?
Yup, socialists believed wealth and resources should be shared more equally to avoid the massive disparity seen in capitalist societies. And the reasons for this go way beyond just economics.
Like economic inequality?
Yes, under capitalism, wealth tends to concentrate in the hands of a few. While the majority struggle to make ends meet, this gap between the rich and the poor was one of the biggest complaints that led to the socialist movement.
And there was worker exploitation, right?
Yes, workers in capitalist economies were seen as being exploited. They worked long hours and shareholders were the ones making the real money. Karl Marx states the history of all hetero societies has been a history of class struggles.
What about social injustice?
Yeah, that was another big issue. Many socialists believe that capitalism reinforced inequalities related to race, gender, and class. The system, they argued, prioritized profit over people, which kept marginalized groups in a lower economic position.
So what did Marxists suggest as a solution?
Karl Marx and his followers had some pretty radical ideas. One of the main ones was abolishing private property, at least when it came to major industries. They believed that factories, land, and resources shouldn't be owned by individuals looking to make a profit, but instead by the workers or the government, so wealth could be distributed more fairly.
And that's where wealth redistribution comes in, right?
Yes, Marxists argue that instead of wealth piling up at the top, it should be spread out, so everyone has access to basic necessities and opportunities.
And what about worker control?
That was also another major point. Marxists believed workers should have a direct say in their workplaces, making decisions about wages, working conditions, and production rather than being at the mercy of factory owners. Another Karl Marx quote is, "Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains."
So socialism was basically a response to capitalism's worst problems?
Exactly. It wasn't just about economics. It was about fairness, security, and making sure workers weren't left behind.
So we've covered industrialization and socialism, but another major response to the harsh conditions workers faced during the Industrial Revolution was the labor movement.
Right, workers weren't just sitting back and accepting terrible conditions. They started pushing back.
Exactly. The labor movements of the 19th century were driven by the need for better working conditions and fair treatment in industrial economies.
So what were the biggest issues workers were dealing with?
Well, the first big issue was poor working conditions. Factories were overcrowded, dangerous, and unhealthy, with long hours and low wages, and there was absolutely no job security, so many workers had very little protection.
And we're talking about adults and children, right?
Yes. Child labor was a huge problem. Factories employed children and they worked in the worst conditions, often in small spaces with heavy machinery and for very little pay.
That sounds terrible. Were there any protections for the workers back then?
No, not really. There were no laws to ensure fair wages, safety, or even reasonable working hours. The employers had all the control. If workers didn't like it, they could easily be replaced.
So how did the labor movement start?
Workers began to organize. They started demanding things like shorter hours, better wages, safer working conditions, and an end to child labor.
And there were public protests too, right?
Exactly. Workers organized demonstrations to draw attention to their plight and rally public support. Labor unions also started forming, giving workers a collective voice to negotiate with employers.
So did these efforts actually work?
Over time, yes, it wasn't easy. Many workers faced harsh conditions, even violence from employers and the government. But eventually, the labor movements helped bring about major reforms, like the 8-hour workday, minimum wages, and child labor restrictions.
All right, let's move on to our last segment, Asian states. While European industrialization took off, Asian states had to decide how to respond. Some resisted, while others tried to adopt European methods to strengthen their own nations. The Ottoman Empire, for example, launched a series of reforms known as the Tanzimat, aimed at modernizing their military, legal, and education systems.
So what exactly did those reforms look like?
Well, in terms of the military, the Ottomans created European-style units and set up schools to train officers using Western techniques. They also looked to adopt European administrative methods to strengthen the state and integrate Western technology into their infrastructure.
Did they fully industrialize like Europe?
Not exactly. While they made efforts to modernize, they didn't become a major industrial power like Britain or Germany. But these reforms did help them stay more competitive against European nations.
What about China? How did the Qing react to the industry?
At first, the king resisted European influence, but after their defeat in the Opium Wars, they realized they needed to adapt. That led to self-strengthening movement where they focused on modernizing the military, diplomatic strategies, and education system by incorporating Western military techniques and technology.
But did the movement work?
It had some successes like improving the military and infrastructure, but it wasn't enough to fully industrialize China. Internal resistance and foreign pressures kept them from catching up to the European powers. And with that, we've covered how Asian states reacted to industrialization.
That wraps it up for today.
Thanks for listening, and we will see you next time. Wait, oh my god.
Guys, I'm adding more.
Dude, we're at 11. We gotta go. Okay.